this is a report on a report. So the New York Times put out a huge report on the CIA's involvement in Ukraine this week. That is a massive story. And so in the interest of time, I chose a different source that describes the findings of that. And what I like to do whenever possible is pick a source that is most likely to be hostile to my point of view so that people can't say, well, that's just propaganda. You can't call this Russian propaganda because this piece right here, how the CIA supports Ukraine and vice versa, this is from the Kiev Post, Ukraine's global voice. So they did a write-up on the Times piece. The New York Times published an investigative report on Sunday quoting anonymous sources from among the intelligence communities in the U.S., Europe, and Ukraine who say that the U.S. CIA has helped Ukraine to establish 12 secret spy bases throughout the country. According to the report, the CIA and other U.S. intelligence services track the movements of Russian troops, gather intelligence for missile strikes, and maintain spy networks with the help of these bases. For almost 10 years, the U.S. has been helping Kiev to train a, quote, new generation of Ukrainian spies who are operating globally against Russia. Thanks to this network of bases, Kiev has become one of Washington's most important intelligence partners. It has proved so successful that prior to the war, they were producing more intelligence than U.S. intelligence staff in Ukraine were able to process, and today are intercepting more Russian communications than the CIA's own base in Russia, the New York Times notes. The network of CIA bases in Ukraine began to be established 8 years ago. The news site says they were assembled, quote, piece by piece under U.S. Presidents Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden. At first, U.S. intelligence was reluctant to work with Kiev because it feared that many former Soviet Ukrainian intelligence officials might be compromised and would pass information to Russia, or that the CIA interaction with them might provoke Moscow. However, all that changed in 2015 when General Valery Kondratyuk, I hope I said that name right, who was then the head of Ukraine's military intelligence directorate, handed over a stack of top secret files to the CIA representative in the U.S. Embassy without warning. After this, the Times wrote, Ukrainian intelligence regularly provided Americans with classified information to, quote, create conditions of trust. This was well before the war, right? Like I said, this was 2015, after the coup. The New York Times claims that the Ukrainians proved themselves to the Americans by collecting intercepted data that helped prove Russian involvement in the downing of the Malaysia Airlines jetliner in 2014. Ukrainians also helped Americans prosecute the Russian agents who interfered in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. It was because of this newfound trust that the CIA began training an elite Ukrainian special forces unit known as Unit 2245, which captured Russian drones and communications equipment so that CIA technicians could reverse engineer them and crack Moscow's encryption systems. One of the officers in this unit was the current HUR chief Kryllo Budanov. As a result of the spy bases, yeah, these are tough, man. As a result of the spy bases, the U.S. Embassy in Kiev, quote, became the best source of information, signals, and everything else about Russia, a former senior U.S. official told the New York Times. According to the Times, in the run-up to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, one of the heads of Russian intelligence services reported to Russian President Vladimir Putin that the CIA and MI6 control Kiev and were turning the neighboring country into a beachhead for operations against Moscow. Putin has frequently asserted that the overthrow of the pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych in 2014 was achieved with the support of the CIA, but the Times investigation dispelled that version, pointing rather to how Putin and his advisors misread a critical dynamic. According to the newspaper, the CIA didn't push its way into Ukraine. U.S. officials were often reluctant to fully engage, fearing that Ukrainian officials could not be trusted and worrying about provoking the Kremlin. So there's a lot there. Number one, whether Putin is correct that the CIA was involved in the coup, they were certainly involved in the aftermath of the coup, and we knew that from the Victoria Nuland phone call that famously leaked, right?
Fuck the EU.
Right, fuck the EU, which meant they were instrumental in creating the post-revolution government i.e., a government that was hostile to Russia. So, not to say it doesn't matter whether they were involved in the coup itself, because that's obviously an important for the historical record. But functionally, as it pertains to post-Maidan revolution relations between Russia and Ukraine, with the question mark of U.S. or CIA involvement, it's not really necessary that they helped overthrow the government. The fact that they involved themselves afterwards, gave them a stance that was very hostile to Russia. It's also amazing, given this report, that the original terms to call off the Ukraine war did not involve Kiev whatsoever. Not whatsoever. The original Russian terms were, we want Crimea to be recognized as ours. We want independence for these eastern separatist regions, who didn't want to go along with the post-coup Ukrainian government. And we want a neutral Ukraine. So even despite these findings, and according to this report, it seems Putin was made aware, or at least strongly persuaded, that Kiev was working with the CIA in a way that was hostile to his country. The fact that control over Kiev was really not something he was particularly interested in at the beginning of the war just shows you how avoidable the war was in the first place. Even if Kiev was working with American intelligence, he still did not seek to conquer that country. So right. That is quite the report to come out of the New York Times. Like I said, this is a short summary of it. We'd be here all day if we read the New York Times piece. It's about a 45 to 50-minute read. But that's a good summary from a Ukrainian source. So that's not Kremlin spin, Yeah.
Right. Well, and this is where, anybody who starts trying, like Cornel West did, well, there are a lot of people who don't want to talk about the gangster Putin and what goes on in his country. And hey, man, as far as what goes on in his country, that's none of my business. That is his country. I don't say one way or the other. I honestly don't know enough about it. For the same reason, it's hard to comment on China. It's almost impossible to get information that doesn't represent somebody's agenda, whether the agenda of China or Russia or the agenda of the U.S. State Department. It's almost impossible to find objective reporting on the subject of what's going on inside either of those countries. I don't know. I suspect that the Russian state is repressive. I also know they're torturing Julian Assange to death in the West. So I'm not all that inclined to use it as a basis of moral superiority of Western interests re Russia and Putin. That's all irrelevant. When you're talking about the matter of this war, if the United States thought Mexico was conspiring with Russian intelligence or Chinese intelligence to the level that we considered it a threat, we'd be in there so fast it would make your sombrero spin.
And we would not be litigating territorial disputes near the border. We'd want the whole thing. We'd want the whole thing. Sorry.
We'd have to save Mexico from foreign infiltrators who have misled the Mexican people, right? We'd annex it.
Of course.
We would install a puppet government. There is no fucking way we would allow that next to our border. So whatever you think about Putin or what's going on with Russia, it's completely irrelevant. Was Russia provoked? Yes.
Yeah,
yes, they were provoked.
Yeah.
They were provoked for decades. They were provoked for much longer than I believe, based on our own history, the United States would ever have allowed a provocation like that to go on.
Right. Exactly. And the more you look at this, and this report is just the latest in a series, that has come out since the war started. Like, the more you look at this and think, well, it is the anti-Ukrainian position to have thought that they should have agreed to those three terms. Agreeing to those three terms would have saved Ukraine. Ukraine has no present right now, and it has no future right now. I mean, the country has been decimated. It was obviously in Ukraine's interest to accept that deal. That was an amazing deal that they were offered. And now that they turned it down because the West tricked this moron president of theirs into thinking he was the Winston Churchill of the 21st century.
It's very heroic.
Yeah. Now they're fucked. They're fucked, and their country is decimated for decades down the line now. It's amazing. And the coverage, I had a thought about this too. Like, when you think of the carnage in Ukraine, you are talking about devastation and bloodshed that is really of a magnitude that we have not seen in quite some time. And it is just incredible to think how sanitized the coverage of that war has been in the U.S. media. Like, Gaza, you can't say the coverage is sanitized. I mean, it's more biased towards Israel than we would like it to be, obviously. But you are seeing on CNN, we've shown many reports. They'll go into Gaza.
CNN
they'll
has
show
done
the devastation.
surprisingly decent coverage here and there.
Exactly. Here and there. Right. Not as a rule, but here and there. In Ukraine, you got the libs still thinking that Ukraine is on track to win.
Right.
On track to win.
Right.
Just an absolute total lie. And a lie told at the expense of hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, it's a horrible tragedy for both countries. Russia's losing a lot of men too, but it's a horrible tragedy for Ukraine. And so these idiots think that what? They're doing Ukraine a favor by trying to get $60 billion more through? For what? It's over. It's done. It's lost.
Well, this was something, I sent this over to you this morning. There wasn't time to do it. So Putin just gave a speech in Russia, partly in response, it seems, to Macron threatened would not rule out sending troops into Ukraine. The Germans wisely slapped that down, at least in regards to their own country, when asked about sending troops in. And Putin said, hey, they have to remember, we have weapons too. And if this gets into that kind of a conflict, it could lead to nuclear war, which could be the end of civilization.
Right. I mean, we were thinking we may have dodged that. We were thinking, okay, the war is lost, it's going to wind down. But it seems like the U.S. is getting more psychotic in its attempts to double down as the war draws closer to its natural end. Right? I mean, it doesn't seem like we're taking the hint that, hey, the right thing to do is to just make a deal. And tragic. I mean, this is the story of every U.S. war since World War II, since after World War II is, and this is what Jeremy Corbyn said at the start of the war. Says all wars end in diplomacy. So why don't we skip the killing part and go right to the talking part? Because it was very obvious in this case that whatever deal you make after the fighting is going to, if you're lucky, resemble very, very closely the deal you had an opportunity to make before the fighting. And so what was all this for? This was for the enrichment of Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and I think more and more, this was about exposing the West to Russia's military powers and wearing them down should there be a conflict with China. Because there's no way, I am sorry, whatever bullshit they're trying to tell us, there is no way the people like the Jake Sullivans and the Anthony Blinkens and the Lloyd Austins, the people who actually know the situation on the ground, there is absolutely no way they think Ukraine has any chance at winning, which means take that off the table. That's not their motive. Their motive has to be something else. Their motive has to be to get eyes on Russia's military and to wear them down so that if there's another world war on another front, Russia is weaker. It's psychotic. It's suicidal. It's anti-human. And this has been, if we step back and take a macro view of this, this is why I say Donald Trump is not a man of peace, but Donald Trump is playing Russian roulette with at least one empty chamber in the gun, because through chance and randomness and chaos, all of which are characteristics of Donald Trump, you might avoid this. Might. It's not a guarantee. It's not a likelihood, but it's a possibility. This is the road to hell. These people are psychos. This is going one way, the wrong way. That's obvious to anyone.
Damn it. He might be a half-bright game show host, but Donald Trump is the only chance this country has, man.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I absolutely feel that the chances of World War III are somewhat lessened if Donald Trump wins the election, because I can't imagine him saying, you know what, let's commit troops. No. I could definitely imagine a second term of the Democrats, whoever that might be, deciding we simply cannot let the Russians have their way.
Right. That's the way they're signaling right now. That's the way they're sounding right now. They've gotten crazier as reality has set in more.
Yes.
Right. As reality becomes more and more obvious, they become more insane. Right. They don't become more sane as reality gets more obvious. They double down.
I think you're right about the military factor. I think they legit miscalculated about the economics. I
Yeah,
think
that's
in
true.
their arrogance, they legitimately did not realize how much there was a global South and a BRICS and an anti-US movement that would figure out a workaround,
That's
and
true.
how they
Yes.
would only empower these alternative payment systems.
You're right. I think you're right about that. I do not think they saw coming. They thought Russia's economy was going to tank,
Yeah.
and that they were going to be under pressure in the long term to, be more agreeable to whatever it is we wanted, i.e., NATO membership for Ukraine, which they're still talking about. They're still talking about as
Well,
if that's going to be allowed to happen.
in the end, we're undermined by our own capitalist imperatives, because with the whole workaround black market, the way the
Of
oil
course,
winds
yeah,
around the world, the biggest purchaser of Russian crude is us.
right,
We're
yeah,
buying their fucking oil because in the end, we're not going to allow the oil prices to go up to what they really would be if you really took Russian oil off the market in the West.
right, indeed.
Please clap.